my name's Jenny, and behind the camera there, that's Kitty.
Hello!
And we're the Naturalist Interns here at the Arboretum. And for today's video, we want to talk a little bit about parasitism, because we think it's super cool, maybe a little bit creepy, and always fun to kind of discuss and talk about. But before we dive right in, probably be good to define what parasitism is. And parasitism, parasite, comes from the Greek word parasitos, meaning to eat at a table of another, which I think is a really apt way to describe it. Parasitism is basically a form of symbiosis. So with symbiosis, it's basically a long-term interaction between two species. In nature, there's all sorts of different forms of symbiosis. In addition to parasitism, there's also commensalism and mutualism. But the difference between all these things are, parasitism involves one species gaining advantage, profiting at the expense of another species. Whereas things like commensalism, one species gains, whereas the other species in that interaction, that relationship, doesn't really have anything. It doesn't lose out, it doesn't gain anything, it doesn't really care. And with mutualism, both species in the interaction gain something. There's something in it for both of them. So that's kind of the definition of parasitism, how it differs from other forms of symbiosis. And when you think of one species gaining at the expense of another form of animal interaction out in nature that really comes to mind is predation. And predation and parasitism have a lot of things in common. You both have one species kind of using another for resources, but there's a couple of key differences. Now with predation, they usually kill their prey right away. So the interaction is really, really brief. Which doesn't count as symbiosis. It just really doesn't fit in that description at all. It also means that a predator also tends to be much larger than the prey species in that relationship, faster, with a lot of tools to help it take down that prey. Whereas with parasitism, parasites tend to, I won't say always, but they tend to not kill their prey or their host because they depend on it. They want that host to live so they can continue to profit and gain off of that host from that relationship. So because of this, a lot of parasites tend to be smaller than their host, and they tend to reproduce much faster and live shorter lives than the host as well, though there are exceptions to this. And these are kind of the key differences between predation and parasitism. But really interestingly enough, there is overlap between the two in terms of how they work. And there is a famous entomologist, his name was E.O. Wilson, and he once described parasitism as predation in units of less than one, which I thought was a really fun way to look at it and think of how it works, which is really cool. Now that we're all experts on what parasitism is, we might as well dive right in and look at some examples that we'll see around here in the Arboretum. And I will say parasitism, once you start looking, is actually one of the most common lifestyles out in nature. A lot of different species take advantage of it, so there's tons of examples out there. But we'll go with 3 very common ones that you might see around. And one of them is actually right here. Get in here a little bit. But if you look at this tree beside me, you might notice it has all these kind of black knobs all over the branches. Kids that we kind of have visiting the Arboretum like to call this poop on a stick, which is a very descriptive name, and it's also commonly known as black knot. If you're a gardener at home, this might be a familiar sight for you. And what black knot is it's a parasitic fungus. Now, when I say fungus, a lot of people tend to think of mushrooms with that nice stalk and cap and decomposition. And while that's true, a lot of different species of fungus are key decomposers and feed off of dead things like dead wood or dead debris. And it doesn't really fit the term parasitism. It's not really profiting off another live organism. There are different species of parasitic fungus as well, and black knot is one of them. This fungus actually parasitizes prunus trees. So those are your plums and your cherries. And these guys, they form these kind of black bulges. And this is made out of both the tissue of the fungus and gall, so excess plant tissue that the fungus stimulates the plant to make. And this is actually pretty harmful for the plant. Over time, it can really do a lot of damage to the plant. So that's an example of a parasite in the fungus world. But of course, it's not just fungus that have, or not just fungi that include parasites. You know, parasites can be found in all sorts of different kingdoms and families. And I actually have another example. I've been carrying it around in my pocket, as one does. And this is a caterpillar, 2 caterpillars actually. And they're no longer alive, so that's why we have them in this little vial. But if you look closely, you'll see that there's little dots all over the body of this dry caterpillar. And these dots were made while the caterpillar was alive, these little holes. And that's because these caterpillars were parasitized. Now, earlier when we were talking about the differences between parasitism and predation, we talked about how they overlap and how they differ. Well, these guys were actually parasitized by what we call a parasitoid, which is a category of parasites that kind of really toe the line between parasites and predators. So with a parasitoid, it's a parasite that kind of gradually over time eventually kills its host. So it could kind of be seen as a long drawn out predation of sorts, which is really interesting. But if we think of parasitoids in nature, you can kind of group them in 2 major categories. You have your idiobionts parasitoids, which are parasitoids, I should say, that will find a prey item, they'll sting it and paralyze it. A lot of these parasitoids tend to be wasps. It'll sting it, they'll paralyze it, and they'll bring it back to their nest where they will kind of lay an egg in with this paralyzed prey item. They'll seal up the nest, and that means that this egg inside this nest is going to hatch into a larva that then has fresh live prey to feed off of. So this is an example of idiobionts parasitoid, and the parasite grows outside of the host or prey, and the host or prey usually is inhibited from growing further, from advancing into different life stages. Now, with the parasitoids that took advantage of these caterpillars, what we have is actually what we call coinobionts parasitoid. And with this, it includes a lot of wasps in a family called the ichneumonids. And these are so cool. What the ichneumonids do is these wasps, the female ones, will find a lot of different caterpillars or insects. A lot of them specialize in caterpillars. And what they'll do is they'll inject their eggs inside this caterpillar. And the eggs will hatch inside this caterpillar into larvae that actually eat the caterpillar from the inside out, while the caterpillar is still alive, still growing. And with this type of parasitism, usually the host is allowed to keep advancing onto the next life stage and keep alive to sustain the parasitoids inside them for a certain amount of time, usually regulated by hormones that the parasitoid will produce, mimicking the host's own natural body hormones, which is pretty neat. And these holes all over these caterpillars are actually where the parasitoid eventually busted out of the body to grow out into adult wasps to wander the world. So that's pretty neat, and definitely a really cool example of a parasitoid, a type of parasitism. And it doesn't stop there. You know, we have parasites in the fungus world, in the insect world, but we have them in the vertebrate world as well. And I might turn things over to Kitty to talk about that. Yeah, not a lot of people suspect it, but we have parasites among the birds as well. So if you come on over here, I have with me a biodiversity sheet. We make these sheets with pictures of all sorts of different animals on all sorts of different subjects here at the Arboretum, so you can order it on the website if you are interested. But today I'm using backyard birds in your neighborhood, and we're going to take an especially close look at these 2 guys right here. So these are the brown-headed cowbirds, very aptly named. The male has a nice brown head and a shiny black body. The females are a lot more drab brown all around. But these are a species of bird that nests and lives right here at the Arboretum, and they are actually an example of a parasite within the bird world. See, these guys are actually what we called brood parasites. So they practice something called brood parasitism, which means that a nice female cowbird is gonna go along and it's gonna find another species of bird that is making their nests. So maybe this little cowbird flies along and sees a maybe chipping sparrow nest. It's actually gonna lay its eggs inside of the nest of the other species. And then it's gonna take off. It's actually not even gonna raise its own young. It's gonna leave that job to the other species of birds. And they practice brood parasitism on a whole bunch of different species of birds. So of course that means that those other bird species have to do the job of raising somebody else's young. And because these cowbirds, they grow really quickly and can be quite big as well, they usually get taken care of by the other species at the expense of the other species' own young even. So these guys are brood parasites. And that means that if they're not raising their own young, then that frees up resources for them to do other things like foraging or mating or producing more eggs. So it works out really, really well for them. And this is a really, really interesting behavior. We think that maybe this is a behavior that has evolved because a long time ago, these guys, when they foraged for food, they used to follow herds of bison that were moving across the land. And those bison will flush up all sorts of insects from the ground. And these guys will follow the bison for the sole purpose of eating all of those insects that are flung up into the air for them. It's kind of like an all-you-can-eat buffet for them. But of course that leads to a very nomadic lifestyle. They're moving all the time and they don't really have the ability to stay in one place and build a nest to raise their own young. So they've instead taken to laying their eggs in other birds' nests so that other birds will raise their young for them. And that means that over time, this is what they do now, even in the Arboretum sometimes and all over North America, which is really, really cool actually. But of course, this only works if the bird that they're laying the eggs in, the nest of, they accept the eggs as their own or they choose to not eject the egg. Now, some bird species though have actually found a way around this. So if you come on over here, I have a collection of eggs for you guys to see here. So if we take a look here, this is the brown-headed cowbird egg. This is what they look like. They're pretty speckly and pale. And we have another bird in the Arboretum here called the American goldfinch. Now, the American goldfinch, if it finds one of the brown-headed cowbird eggs in the nest, they will usually raise it as their own, but they don't tend to get parasitized very, very often. In fact, only a very small percentage of American goldfinch nests actually get parasitized. And that has to do with a couple of reasons. One is that they are a very late nester. They tend to lay their eggs and build their nests much later in the season in the late summer. And also, they found that when American goldfinches are raising cowbird eggs, the eggs don't tend to do very well, and there isn't a lot of success with the fledglings going on to fledge successfully. So they think that this may be because the American goldfinch have a very, very high seed diet. They eat a lot of seeds, whereas a lot of other bird species rely on a very insect-rich diet early on in their life. So maybe the cowbirds aren't getting enough nutrition. Of course, we have another bird here in the Arboretum called the yellow warbler. It's a small yellow bird, and they absolutely do recognize brown cowbird eggs. And if they find a brown cowbird egg in their nest, what they're gonna do is that yellow warbler is actually gonna build a whole new nest on top of that egg and start again. So the yellow warbler has found a way around brood parasitism of the brown-headed cowbird by building a whole new nest on top of its egg. So that way they don't have to raise the cowbird baby. And yet another bird that we have here in the Arboretum is the gray capper. So this bird here. This bird is also another bird that can recognize the egg of the brown-headed cowbird. Now this bird though, what it does is if it sees that egg inside of its nest, it's actually going to take it and then kick it out of the nest. It's gonna eject the egg and not have to raise the brown-headed cowbird. So these are 3 different ways that these 3 different bird species has found a way to protect themselves from the brood parasitism of the brown-headed cowbird. But of course, sometimes the brown-headed cowbird likes to stick around and check on their eggs in other birds' nests. So studies have actually found that the parents will actually visit and check on the eggs that they have laid before. And if they found that the egg has been kicked out or rejected out of the nest, studies have found that brown-headed cowbirds actually do something called mafia behavior, where they ransack the nest where their eggs have been rejected from, in kind of a retaliation behavior, which is really, really funny.
So petty.
Yeah. Another behavior that scientists actually encounter with brown-headed cowbirds is something called farming behavior. So if brown-headed cowbirds notice that a lot of birds around them have already established their eggs, or have already established their nests and have already laid their eggs, and there's no more opportunity for them to parasitize the nest, what they're going to do is they're going to destroy all those nests and force those birds to build another one. And then they get a chance to actually lay their eggs in other birds' nests. So they found that they've actually parasitized the majority of these new nests. So these brown-headed cowbirds have figured out a very, very unique way to raise their young, which is very, very cool.
Definitely a bird to keep an eye out for here in the Arboretum.
Yeah, and all those birds live right here in the Arboretum, so this is something that you can even encounter and even watch this behavior if you're lucky enough, which I think is super cool. And you know what? I think all of these parasites, whether they're birds or fungi or insects, they get a bit of a bad rep. Most people don't look too kindly among parasites, but we have to remember that these guys do an important job in ecosystem as well. They keep all of the host species and all of the prey species populations under control. So they have a really fine balance here in the ecosystem. They have their own important role to be here in our world, and they're lovely and unique and amazing in their own way. So we should all learn to appreciate them just a little bit more. Now that brings us to the end of our video this week. Thank you so much for joining us, and maybe we'll see you next week.